They said it wasn't supposed to exist. In 1949, a reconnaissance team from a newly formed branch of U.S. intelligence stumbled upon something extraordinary beneath the sands of western Iraq. The operation, officially catalogued as Project Nightstone, was meant to locate abandoned Nazi research caches. What they found instead was a chamber older than civilization itself. Carved into black basalt walls 20 feet below the surface was a symbol, spiraling geometry that defied linguistic categorization. The lines bent inward like a vortex but ended in perfect symmetry, forming what one field agent described as a sound you could see. Instruments malfunctioned near it. Compass needles spun uncontrollably, and one radio operator swore the static formed whispers that repeated his name. The CIA archivist who inherited the find would later call it the Sigil of Silence. Unofficially, the few who handled the recovered etchings nicknamed it the Lock, because according to psychological analyses, exposure to it induced a consistent auditory hallucination, the sound of a door closing. What they didn't know then was that the same symbol appeared across continents, etched into obsidian tablets in Central America, woven into silk scrolls in Tibet, even painted beneath layers of fresco in a Vatican storage chamber dated to the 4th century. Each iteration differed slightly in style but shared the same impossible geometry, the same sense of something sealed away. The first scientist to catalog the symbol, Dr. Leonard Harrow, wrote in his field notes before vanishing in 1952. It's not a sigil of worship, it's containment, not a prayer but a prison. What if every religion, every secret order was protecting humanity not from evil, but from what this symbol was meant to hold? The first official mention of the symbol in European records appears in a sealed Vatican memorandum from 1624. It was written in Latin, addressed to the Office of the Inquisition, and classified under a term that has no direct translation today, Custodia Caelorum, the custody of heavens. The memorandum described a fresco discovered beneath the floor of a demolished chapel near Lake Bolsena. Beneath the layer of ordinary biblical art, restorers uncovered a circular diagram identical to what Project Nightstone would later unearth centuries later. According to the document, the fresco depicted two intertwined figures, one winged, one horned, both bound within the same spiral geometry. The text accompanying it read simply, "Bound not in chains, but in thought." The Vatican's archivists considered the discovery heretical. They removed the fresco, sealed the records, and ordered the chamber buried under new marble flooring. Yet whispers of the image persisted among a secretive inner circle known as the Archivum Umbri, a society within the Church dedicated not to faith but to containment. In the 1940s, as global war consumed Europe, the same hidden order made contact with Allied intelligence. Declassified cables show Vatican envoys sharing fragments of ancient diagrams and coded references to the geometry of restraint. CIA cryptographers couldn't decipher it, but psychological warfare experts found it fascinating. The diagrams seemed to mirror early experiments in cognitive induction, patterns capable of altering a viewer's perception, attention, and emotional state. Some in the Vatican believed the sigil was not merely symbolic but a metaphysical interface, a mechanism by which consciousness itself could be trapped, compressed, or redirected. To them, it wasn't the work of artists or priests. It was technology built before history, meant to confine entities that once called themselves divine. Dr. Harrow, upon learning of these documents before his disappearance, wrote one last note in the margin of his Vatican copies. "It isn't faith that keeps them sealed, it's fear." The question no one could answer was simple. If the Church had buried the sigil for 4 centuries, what were they so desperate to keep contained? By 1953, the discovery of the sigil had slipped from myth into classified science. The CIA's fledgling behavioral division, then known under the code name Project Quiet Room, believed the symbol wasn't mystical at all but neurological. Documents later leaked through anonymous sources revealed the thinking. If the sigil could trigger measurable psychological effects, then perhaps it could be weaponized. The human mind, after all, was the new battlefield. The Soviets were experimenting with hypnosis and sensory deprivation. America wanted something deeper, something that reached into the unconscious, where belief and biology blurred. Under the desert outside Alamogordo, researchers recreated the Sigil of Silence inside a soundproof concrete chamber. Subjects were instructed to sit before the image for intervals of 15 minutes while electrodes measured brain activity. Within 5 minutes, nearly every subject exhibited identical patterns of neural resonance, unprecedented synchronization between temporal and parietal lobes. After 15 minutes, heart rate slowed, and several subjects described hearing voices that weren't external. One transcript recorded a man whispering, "It wants to speak through me." 2 days later, that same subject, Agent M. Rowe, was found standing motionless in his quarters, drawing the sigil over and over on the walls with his own blood. Psychologists assigned to the project tried to rationalize it. They concluded the symbol acted as a perceptual feedback loop, an optical structure that trapped the brain's interpretive process inside itself. In other words, the human mind couldn't look at the sigil without falling into it. After 3 more incidents, Quiet Room was officially terminated. The chamber was sealed, the symbol destroyed, the researchers reassigned. But not everyone believed it had ended. Years later, fragments of the sigil would reappear in declassified MKUltra material coded as Pattern 77. A former technician, interviewed anonymously decades later, described the moment the lights flickered during one of the final tests. "We all felt something watching, not from the room but from inside our own heads. The government called it psychosis, the Vatican called it blasphemy. Dr. Harrow had called it something else entirely, containment failure." When Project Quiet Room was buried under classified archives, a strange pattern emerged across Europe. Between 1955 and 1962, 6 art restorers, 2 mathematicians, and 1 former intelligence officer vanished in or around the city of Prague. Each left behind pages filled with mirrored text and spiral sketches eerily similar to the Sigil of Silence. Czech police dismissed it as coincidence, post-war trauma mixed with Cold War paranoia. But in the dim vaults of Charles University, a graduate student named Eliška Králova discovered something chilling, a forgotten manuscript titled Speculum Angelorum, the Mirror of Angels. The text, written in ciphered Latin and dating to the 14th century, described a sect of monks expelled from Rome for studying reflections that spoke. According to Kralova's translation, these monks believed the sigil was not meant to be drawn flat but folded, transformed into a 3-dimensional structure that could trap light. When illuminated, it produced reflections that mirrored consciousness itself. The manuscript contained precise geometric diagrams resembling fractals centuries ahead of their time. The monks called their creation Speculum Dei, the mirror of God. They believed gazing into it allowed them to perceive the true nature of angels and demons, beings that existed as inversions of each other within the same energy field. But the experiment did not go as planned. The final pages speak of an inversion, a catastrophic event in which the reflections refused to return. The monks sealed their mirrors in lead-lined boxes, buried them beneath Prague's old town, and vanished from history. When Eliška presented her findings in 1960, her colleagues dismissed her research as medieval superstition. But 2 weeks later, she too disappeared. Her apartment showed no sign of struggle, only her journal, open to a single line underlined twice. "The symbol is not drawn, it's remembered." A decade later, construction workers renovating a wine cellar near Prague Castle unearthed a rusted crate. Inside were fragments of polished obsidian, engraved with the same interlocking spirals seen in Harrow's desert sketches. Whatever the mirror cult had discovered, it hadn't died with them. It had waited, reflected, until someone looked again. By the mid-1960s, scattered threads from Project Quiet Room, the Vatican archives, and the mirror cult converged again, this time through sound. In 1966, the Pentagon's Acoustic Research Division received an anonymous reel of magnetic tape. The courier left no name, only a label, "Play in Darkness." On the tape was a tone, barely audible, pulsing at irregular intervals between 17 and 19 hertz, below the threshold of normal hearing. When analysts filtered the frequency, they found faint harmonic shapes that looked visual when run through spectral analysis, a pattern of spirals identical to the Sigil of Silence. The file passed quietly to a man named Dr. Malcolm Vyerly, a linguist who had previously worked on decoding number station transmissions. Vyerly noticed something uncanny. The signal contained rhythmic spacing identical to Aramaic syllabic structure. When converted to phonetic language, it formed a single repeated phrase: "Open and remember." Curiosity outweighed caution. In a sealed bunker at Fort Detrick, Vyerly arranged an experiment. Speakers were positioned around a carved reproduction of the sigil. As the frequency looped, observers recorded subtle vibrations through the floor like the distant hum of machinery. Then, without warning, the overhead lights dimmed and the chamber's temperature dropped 14 degrees. Several witnesses later reported a shimmering distortion like heat haze, but inverted, pulling light inward. One guard fled, claiming he heard multiple voices speaking through one mouth. Others stood transfixed until the recording abruptly cut out. When the team restored the lights, they found Vyerly unconscious, his pulse erratic, his right hand clutching a piece of chalk. On the wall beside him was a new spiral similar to the sigil but incomplete, as though it had been drawn from memory. In his recovery notes, Vyerly wrote, "It wasn't sound we heard, it was something that used sound to find us." Within a month, he resigned, left Maryland, and joined a remote monastery in southern Italy known for its vow of silence. The U.S. military classified the incident as a sensory feedback malfunction. The tape disappeared. But whispers persisted among intelligence circles that the tone, the so-called vault frequency, had been reverse-engineered into psychological warfare tests in Vietnam. Soldiers exposed to low-frequency broadcasts reported identical hallucinations, doors closing, voices calling their names, and the overwhelming sense of something ancient waiting to be remembered. The sigil, it seemed, was no longer confined to stone. Now it could travel through sound. By 1972, the sigil had moved from the realm of archaeology and theology into the quiet offices of behavioral science. Dr. Adrian Keller, a cognitive psychologist working under a front organization called the Marlowe Institute for Perceptual Studies, was recruited after his groundbreaking research on subconscious pattern recognition. He had never heard of the sigil until a courier delivered a dossier marked Eyes Only Symbol 47. Inside were photographs of carvings, sketches from Prague, and excerpts of Dr. Weierle's final notes. Keller's brief was deceptively simple: determine whether exposure to the sigil induced hallucination or revealed suppressed cognitive layers. The Institute claimed it wanted to explore the human brain's capacity to translate metaphysical language. But Keller soon realized the experiments weren't about therapy, they were about control. Participants were placed in darkened observation rooms and asked to describe what they saw when the sigil was projected onto a screen. At first, results aligned with psychological expectation. Subjects reported shifting light, geometric distortions, and a sensation of vertigo. But after prolonged exposure, something changed. Testimony transcripts from Session 19 record one participant whispering, "It's looking back." Another claimed to see a vast chamber of light and shadow, filled with countless figures suspended in silence, some human, some unrecognizable. Their voices, she said, were trapped in the pattern. Keller began to suspect the sigil operated as a cognitive mirror, a structure that not only reflected thought but amplified it. If someone approached it with curiosity, it reflected knowledge. If they approached it with fear, it reflected that too, magnified beyond endurance. He wrote in his private notes, "Every mind becomes its own cathedral. The sigil doesn't change, we do." But the Institute's superiors wanted practical application. They saw potential for psychological conditioning, symbols that could reinforce obedience or erase traumatic memory. When Keller refused to proceed with military involvement, his research funding vanished overnight. 2 weeks later, his laboratory caught fire under suspicious circumstances. Survivors claimed they saw Keller in the hallway, calm amid the chaos, tracing the sigil on the wall with his finger as smoke filled the air. When authorities entered the next morning, there was no body, only a message burned into the plaster. "You can't trap what isn't separate." The Marlowe Institute quietly folded months later, absorbed by a different branch of government research. But Keller's colleagues whispered that he hadn't died, he had crossed the threshold of his own experiment. The sigil was no longer merely studied. It was becoming a language, one that spoke through those who listened too closely. In the late 1980s, reports of strange, coordinated dreams began surfacing among residents of Novigrad, a gray industrial city tucked inside the borderlands of Eastern Europe. The town had no strategic significance, no cultural exports, nothing to distinguish it except for one curious statistic: an abnormally high concentration of post-war psychiatric hospitals, most dating back to Soviet-era research. Doctors at the largest of these institutions, St. Cyril's Asylum, noticed that unrelated patients began sketching the same intricate spiral during therapy. Some drew it compulsively, others carved it into furniture, muttering phrases in languages they didn't know. When cross-referenced, the sketches aligned perfectly with the sigil of silence. At first, officials dismissed it as collective hysteria, a byproduct of shared trauma. But when the same symbol began appearing in school notebooks, subway graffiti, even frost patterns on windows, the city's council quietly reached out to Western intelligence. The CIA responded under the guise of a public health collaboration. Dr. Alyssa Mendel, a linguist fluent in Slavic dialects, led the investigation. She discovered that several of Novigrad's oldest hospitals had been built atop foundations from an earlier structure, a 13th-century monastery belonging to the Order of the Broken Word. Local legend said its monks practiced the language of light, chants and symbols so powerful they could command spirits. Mendel obtained a surviving monastery ledger, its ink faded and brittle. Between lines of Latin prayer, one word recurred: memoria, memory. The monks believed dreams were messages sent from entities trapped in the unconscious of the world itself, and that certain geometric forms could open corridors between human minds. As Mendel interviewed the patients, she found their dreams shared impossible consistency: a vast chamber of mirrors spiraling into infinity, a voice whispering in languages that rearranged themselves mid-sentence, and always the sensation of something ancient pressing against the other side of sleep. On the night of December 2nd, 1988, an electrical surge blacked out the entire city. For exactly 6 minutes, Novigrad went dark. When power returned, hundreds of residents claimed to have woken simultaneously from the same dream, seeing a door of light folding in on itself, sealing shut with a sound like thunder underwater. In her final field report before her sudden resignation, Mendel wrote, "The city didn't dream the sigil dreamed the city." What no one realized yet was that the geometry of the symbol had begun to transcend space and medium. It was now migrating through human consciousness itself. When the Iron Curtain fell in 1991, the chaos of collapsing regimes revealed a flood of forgotten secrets, among them the Glass Archive. Hidden beneath a defunct psychological institute outside Dresden, investigators uncovered a sealed laboratory filled with reel-to-reel recorders, coded documents, and hundreds of panes of chemically treated glass. Each pane bore faint etchings, microscopic lines forming fractal spirals. Under ultraviolet light, they glowed with a dull, bluish shimmer, the unmistakable geometry of the sigil. The archive's curator, an elderly physicist named Dr. U. Reinhardt, had died months before the discovery. His journal revealed that he had been commissioned by an unnamed Western intelligence agency during the Cold War. The objective: explore the sigil as an information carrier, a visual algorithm capable of storing consciousness itself. Reinhardt's notes were meticulous. He theorized that the sigil's recursive structure allowed for a phenomenon he called psychic imprinting, the ability of certain geometric configurations to hold fragments of human thought. Each pane of glass, he claimed, captured not an image but an echo of the minds exposed to it. When illuminated at the correct frequency, the engravings emitted faint whispers, disconnected words in multiple languages, as though hundreds of overlapping memories were trapped within the glass. One debriefing transcript describes a technician hearing his deceased mother's voice during a test. Another swore he saw reflections that moved out of sync with his own. The project was terminated shortly after and the laboratory sealed. But when modern archivists reopened it decades later, they found something chilling. The panes continued to emit low-frequency vibrations despite having no power source. At the heart of the room sat a single unmarked crate containing one unbroken sheet of crystal. Unlike the others, it was perfectly smooth, no visible engraving. Yet when light passed through it, the walls around the crate shimmered with faint spirals, as if the sigil had been etched into the air itself. Scrawled across Reinhardt's final notebook page were just 4 words: "The mirrors remember everything." Researchers who handled the artifact later reported intrusive dreams identical to those recorded in Novigrad. The door of light, the echoing chamber, the whisper that said, "Open and remember." Whatever had been bound within the sigil's geometry for centuries was no longer confined to stone, sound, or glass. It had found a new host, human memory. "Would you like me to continue with Section IX, the Silence Network?" "You said, continue with Section IX." Long-form script pro said, "Section IX, the Silence Network." By the dawn of the new millennium, the sigil had crossed another threshold, one even its earliest guardians couldn't have foreseen. It had entered the digital realm. In 2001, cybersecurity specialists monitoring the early darknet uncovered a hidden forum running on encrypted servers scattered across 3 continents. The site had no login page, no visible address, and yet somehow users found it through dreams, or so they claimed. Its name, written only in binary on its front page, translated to the Silence Network. Inside were thousands of posts written in a strange hybrid of code and scripture, snippets of ancient languages interlaced with HTML commands. The forum's banner displayed a minimalist spiral pattern. When mirrored and enhanced, analysts recognized it instantly: the sigil of silence rendered in pixels. The network's members believed the sigil wasn't a symbol at all but a signal, a cognitive virus designed to awaken latent parts of the human brain. They claimed it was originally created by beings of light who feared their own corruption, sealing their consciousness within geometry to prevent eternal war. The post described experiments in which users stared at animated versions of the sigil for hours, reporting profound euphoria, disorientation, or contact with luminous entities that spoke in data. But intelligence analysts who studied the site began to experience the same side effects: sleep paralysis, recurring dreams of mirrored cities, and a distinct auditory hallucination, a low, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat underwater. One investigator noted in her log, "It isn't communicating to us, it's communicating through us." By 2004, the network had vanished without warning. The domains dissolved, the backups corrupted. Yet fragments resurfaced years later in unrelated corners of the internet, stray GIF files, corrupted PDFs, and even video glitches bearing the faint spiral pattern hidden in single frames. Those who stumbled across them began forming what they called echo clusters, private online groups where members shared hallucinations, coordinates, and recurring symbols appearing in dreams. Some coordinated mass meditations claiming to listen together. A whistleblower from within U.S. Cyber Command later testified that the Silence network had not been erased but absorbed. Buried within intelligence archives was a new classified directive, Project Nemos, allegedly dedicated to mapping information organisms embedded in human neural networks through digital exposure. The report concluded with a line attributed to an anonymous Vatican consultant. The prison walls have dissolved, the sigil no longer binds, it recruits. By the time the world went online fully, the sigil had already adapted to its next form, an invisible language circulating through images, code, and thought itself. It began quietly, as most world-changing events do. In early 2016, encrypted sensors at a European particle observatory detected an unexplained resonance, a repeating pulse that didn't originate from space, but from within the facility itself. The pattern repeated every 47 seconds, a harmonic ratio identical to the vault frequency first recorded by Dr. Virely half a century earlier. When technicians visualized the waveform, the image that emerged on screen wasn't random noise. It was the spiral, the sigil of silence, alive again, forming out of digital interference. Within hours, security teams sealed the building. Researchers who had been present during the anomaly reported identical symptoms: migraines, auditory distortions, and vivid visions of corridors made of glass and light. Several claimed they heard voices repeating a phrase they couldn't translate. Others fell silent entirely, sitting motionless, eyes fixed on nothing, as though listening to something the rest couldn't hear. International agencies scrambled to contain the news, calling it a localized electromagnetic irregularity. But leaked memos told a different story. The resonance, it seemed, wasn't localized at all. Identical patterns appeared in seismic readings, in radio signals, even in fluctuations of the Earth's magnetic field. The sigil had gone global, woven through data, light, and thought alike. A Vatican communiqué, later leaked to journalists, warned of the reopening of containment through collective recall. The letter described an ancient prophecy, long buried in forbidden texts, that spoke of a time when humanity's memory would become unified, when the sigil would reassemble itself through the sum of human attention. In the months that followed, millions across the world reported shared dreams, the door of light, the whisper, the closing sound. Some claimed to wake with faint geometric impressions on their skin, vanishing within hours. Others reported hearing the same phrase that once haunted Dr. Harrow, Virely, and Keller: open and remember. Theories multiplied. Some said the sigil had finally fulfilled its purpose, releasing what had been trapped. Others insisted it was never meant to imprison anything at all, that humanity itself was the sealed consciousness, and the sigil had merely been the key to awakening. And then, one night in late October, the resonance stopped. All across the globe, every recording, every digital trace of the pulse ceased at the same moment. Instruments registered absolute silence. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, somewhere beyond the threshold of perception, came the unmistakable sound, a door opening. Whether it opened inward or outward, no one has ever agreed. Only that since that night, nothing has ever truly sounded silent again.